18, as we continue to make our way through, again, a challenging portion of Scripture, but one that is very much needed and helpful. Romans chapter 9, verse 14, it says, "What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? God forbid. For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. For the Scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and on whom he will he hardeneth." Just by way of introduction, we read in Psalm 24:1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein." The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein. If it is true that the earth is the Lord's, including everyone who dwells on that earth, it follows then that he is the one who determines what to do with the earth and the ones who dwell on the earth. Right? If it is his, if it is his creation, that includes everything on the earth, even the people who dwell on it, then it is his to do with as he pleases. Now, this is a concept that on the surface, I think most Christians would say that not only they agree with, but they're comfortable with the implications of this. Again, on the surface, I think most people would say, yeah, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that the earth is the Lord's. However, when the Bible starts to lay out the logical implications of a doctrine such as God's sovereignty, some people begin to balk at this particular idea. We're comfortable with God being sovereign so far as what he does with that sovereignty aligns with what I think needs to be done. Right? The second that God starts doing things that I don't agree with, well, all of a sudden I'm not so comfortable with this sovereignty anymore. This is the heart of the issue at hand. And Paul dispels this particular notion that showing if God is truly sovereign, that he determines the end from the beginning. And one way he does this, we see in our text, is by giving mercy and by hardening, and we'll talk about what that means, those whom he wills. And so, again, this is a challenging portion of Scripture. This is a portion of the Bible that a lot of people either just dismiss altogether, or they get confused, or they get angry. Romans 9 has caused a lot of different emotions in a lot of different people. But we need to understand what Paul is saying here, and when we do, again, it shows us part of God's nature that it should be a comfort to those who are his people. And so we've been talking in Romans 9. There's questions at hand, not to rehash everything that we've already talked about, but particularly with the Jewish Christians, right? They were struggling with some things. If the bulk of the Jews now are rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, what does that mean as far as our status? We're the people of God. We're his chosen people. What does that mean? And so Paul has been walking through this. And so he in the last section we saw, he walked them through a kind of a brief history of Israel, right? God called Abraham, and then he gave the promise of the seed, not to Ishmael, but to Isaac. Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn, but the promised one was Isaac. And then through the children of Isaac, he gave it, again, not to the firstborn, not to Esau, but he gave it to Jacob. And so the line of the promise went through Jacob instead of Esau. And so these were choices of grace. That's what they were. They were choices of grace. And by that, I mean that neither Isaac nor Jacob deserved God's choosing of them. Right? Nothing that Isaac did, nothing that Jacob did was deserving of God's choice of them. And for that matter, I'll say, neither did Ishmael or Esau. Right? They didn't do anything that would deserve God's choosing or rejection of them. These were issues of grace. Now, we know that God owes us nothing. God owes nobody anything other than just judgment. That's what we have. That's what we deserve. If we want to say that there's one thing that I deserve from God, that is just judgment. That's what I deserve. And so when God chooses to show favor to a person, when God chooses to show favor to a nation, this is God giving us what we don't deserve, which is the definition of grace. Grace is God bestowing upon us things we don't deserve. Mercy is God keeping us from us things we do deserve, right? And so grace is giving us things we don't deserve. However, again, people struggle with this idea. Many people, the Jews included, think that they are warranted certain things. We think that we deserve blessing. We think that we deserve favor. We think that we are owed mercy, that we are owed grace. And so when they hear that God chose Isaac and that he rejected Ishmael, they conjure up this idea that somehow God was being unfair. This is something that is levied against him quite often. Well, God's unfair. And so it is this idea of God's unfairness that Paul deals with in our text. And so he responds to this with a particular question. What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? And this is essentially what he's saying. Is God being unfair? That's what Paul is saying. And when God called Abraham, when God chose Isaac, when God chose Jacob, was he being unfair? Now, we could say before addressing anything specific in what he just said, nothing God does could be considered unrighteous. Why? Because God is perfectly holy. God is perfect in his holiness. It would be impossible for God or for anybody who meets his definitions, which just only happens to be God, but it would be impossible for God, whose very nature is perfect and holy, to do anything that is not perfect and holy. Right? It would be impossible for that to take place. Thus, to levy an accusation of unrighteousness against God is to say then that your idea of what is right and wrong is somehow more accurate than the perfect, holy Creator God. Right? Anytime that we have a thought or, we're praying to God or whatever the case may be, and we think, God, why did you do it this way? Now, sometimes we may genuinely just be inquisitive, and we generally want to know the heart of God and why he chose certain things. That's fine. But when we come at him with accusations, why did you do this? Why did you do it this way? I don't think it should have been done that way. I think it should have been done this way. What you were doing then is saying that somehow your idea of what is good and right is better than God's himself. And that's the idea that Paul is speaking against here. However, with regards to his choosing Israel, again, through the line of Isaac and Jacob, that's the direct context of this. I want you to think about it this way. There was never a complaint by the Jews who were of that line. You don't ever read in the Old Testament that David got up and shook his fist at God and said, God, the Edomites should have been in this promise. Right? We never see Solomon say, God, the nations of Ishmael should be included. They should be here with us. You should have included them in the promise. No, they were fine with it. They were fine with it being them until what? Until God said, I'm going to bring in the Gentiles. Now they're struggling with this. And now they think, well, hold on. Something's unfair now. And so the complaint was only coming now that, and we'll see this more as we get into chapter 11 in particular, but the complaint was coming now that there's been a new branch added. The Gentiles are coming in. And so the common, if not unstated, the common refrain of man is this. God is never more fair than when I am receiving the benefits of his mercy. He is never more unfair than when I am receiving the just reward for my actions. That's what we like to think. We may not voice it, we may not say that audibly, but that's certainly what we think at times. And so to answer this, to say, is there unrighteousness in God? Is God being unfair in his sovereign choices? Is God unfairness? Paul uses his common and strong rebuttal, God forbid. May it not be that way. No, God cannot be unrighteous. In other words, this is unthinkably wrong. No, the holy, perfect Creator God has not been unrighteous in his choosing of nations and people. Psalm 92:15, it says, to show that the Lord is upright, he is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. There is no unrighteousness in him. Was God unfair? Was he unrighteous to call Abraham? No. Why? Because Abraham didn't deserve it. What Abraham deserved was for God to damn him to eternal hell. That's what Abraham deserved. Did Isaac and Jacob deserve? No, they didn't deserve it. It was grace. Do we deserve salvation? Absolutely not. Do we deserve any benefit, any aspect of God's grace upon our lives? No, the only thing that we deserve is to be damned to eternal hell. That's what we deserve. That's our wages. We read that earlier in the book of Romans. The wages of our sin. That's what I've actually earned. The wages of our sin is death. No, when God comes in and gives grace, when God comes in and gives mercy, we don't deserve that. This is God going above and beyond that which we actually do deserve. And so no, is God unfair? Is God unrighteous? No, God forbid. No, that would never take place. And so he begins to develop this thought in verse 15. And so what Paul does a lot in chapter 9 here is he states a premise and then he gives an Old Testament example to prove it. And part of the reason why he does it that way is to go back to what I said when we started chapter 9, was to show that God is consistent. What God is doing now is not new. And so Paul consistently says, I'm going to prove that he's new because this concept that I'm teaching you happened in the Old Testament. This is how God acted then. This is how God judged. This is how God did things back then as well. And so there's a consistency with how God operates, with how God, with the way in which God is acting now. There's a consistency there with how he acted in the Old Testament. And so that's what he does. He proves his point there. And so he appeals to the Old Testament. He said, "For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." Now this is a quotation from Exodus 33. And it's important for our understanding of what Paul is saying here to know what was going on in Exodus 33 and 32, right? So we need a little bit of history here. Obviously, if you're familiar with the book of Exodus, you know in chapter 32, Moses is on Mount Sinai. He's receiving the commandments from God. As Moses is up on the mountaintop with God, the people are down at the bottom of the mountain acting quite unrighteously. They have commissioned Aaron, and Aaron has made them a golden calf, and he brought this golden calf before them, and he says, "Here is Yahweh." That's what he tells them. This is God. It's not that he presented this as a false God. He said, no, this is God. This is how we will worship him. We will worship him in the form of this golden calf. And he leads the people in the false worship of this particular golden calf. And then when Moses comes down from the mountain, he actually sees that they were all commanded to strip naked. They were engaged in gross immorality. And so all of these things were taking place as Moses is on the mountaintop, literally residing in the very glory of God. And then the people are down here doing all manner of unthinkable things. And God's anger is righteously hot. In fact, he tells Moses, he says, "I'm going to wipe them all out and I'm starting over with you." That's what he tells Moses. Moses prays. Moses prays for the people, and he pleads with God. All right, don't do this. Now, God was never actually going to do that. I believe that was, I've said this before, I believe that was a test of Moses. But nevertheless, God says, "I won't do it." Now, he does bring a judgment. He does bring a judgment, and 3,000 people die. In fact, the Levites are the ones who carry out that particular judgment. But 3,000 people die. And so the next chapter, chapter 33, Moses again is speaking with God. And he's understandably discouraged. Right? I mean, God has called Moses to lead this group of people, this large group of people, and they've already faced insurmountable obstacles, if not for God. And then yet now, when things finally seem like, well, maybe we're getting on the right track, I'm receiving these commandments from God, things are going to be going well, there's this tremendous setback. God is, again, righteously angry with the people. Moses has to plead and intercede for them. There's still a judgment where 3,000 people die. Moses is basically telling God, I need something from you if this is to continue. If I'm going to continue leading this people, I need some sign from you that this is actually what you want me to do. And so Moses makes this incredibly bold request. He prays to God, "Show me thy glory." I want to see it. I want to see it in a unique way. Now, he had already seen aspects of the glory of God. Before he went up on Mount Sinai, he saw the cloud descend. He heard the thunder, and he sees the lightning. He's seen the pillar of the cloud, the fire. He's seen all of these things. He's seen the glory of God in various ways. But he tells God in a very unique and intimate way, "Show me your glory." And so in response to this, God tells Moses that he will do this. He says, "I will make my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim my name. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock." And then he says this, and he says, "And then I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." In other words, Moses would be able to see, even in the midst of this terrible event, that God was merciful. Now again, think about what those people did. Think about the gross immorality, the idolatry, the false worship. What those people deserved was quick and sudden punishment. That's what they deserved. And you say, well, 3,000 people died. Yes, 3,000 out of a possible upwards of 2 to 3 million people. And so God judged 3,000 out of a possible 2 to 3 million people. You know how many deserve to die? 2 to 3 million. 3,000 died. Did those 3,000 receive something that was unfair? No. They all should have received what the 3,000 received. Did the rest of them receive something that was unfair? No, because God chose to show them mercy. Right? And so in any situation here, God was not being unfair. He just chose to give judgment here, just judgment, by the way. He chose to give mercy here. Nobody got anything that was unfair. And so God was not unfair to anybody that day at Mount Sinai, but he was full of mercy. That's what he was. He was full of mercy. The simple truth is none of us deserve it. None of us deserve grace. None of us deserve mercy. The fact is people expect his mercy and they resent his holiness. That's what happens is people expect mercy. They've come to live in such a way that they think, I can sin, I can do all I want, and God's never going to judge me. God's never going to punish me. They expect his mercy. They resent his holiness. However, Paul tells us, he says, so then it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. Again, God doesn't owe us anything. And yet so many live with the expectation that he in fact does owe us something. Even if we don't think this way, we often live this way. But Paul tells us his mercy is not dependent upon us. It's not dependent on what we think. It's not dependent upon what we desire. It's what he means, it's not up to him that willeth. You may have a strong desire to receive God's mercy, as we all do. Just because you have a desire for it doesn't mean God owes it to you. Right? God doesn't owe you mercy. It's not dependent upon what we do. He said it's not on him that willeth, it's not him that runneth. You may try and work for God's mercy. You may try and do things that you think would compel God to bestow upon you certain spiritual gifts, mercy amongst them, but your works are not what brings mercy. No, Paul tells us again, it has nothing to do with us. In fact, the only way in which God's mercy depends upon us is that we're the ones committing the sins that require God's mercy. That's the only way in which it depends upon us. I like the way the constable said. He said, God is under no obligation to show mercy to anyone. He says, if we insist on receiving just treatment from God, what we will get is condemnation and death. That's just treatment from God. Anything we get above that is just God's love and blessing upon us. And so mercy in and of itself is part of God's sovereign prerogative to give to whom he wills. He's not being unfair. He's not being unfair to grant it here or not grant it here. And so again, it's not up to us. We may struggle with this idea, but we're not the sovereign God of the universe. Now, if you think that was controversial, just wait. The next one's even more so. Just as God is sovereign in his choice to give mercy, he is sovereign in his choice to harden. And this is the one where people typically kind of check out. Paul gives us here, again, another Old Testament example to prove this particular point. He says, for the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. And so Pharaoh, God says, Pharaoh was raised up for this purpose, for this very reason. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, I don't think, as far as him raising him up, I don't think there's anything in particular special or different about this than God raising up anybody who's in power. The Bible tells us, Romans 13 in particular, we'll see it not too long from now, that the people who are in power are the ones that God put in power, right? They're there for a reason, for God's reasoning. I've said it in the past, every time we get to some kind of major election in our country, pray that God gives us what we need, not what we deserve, because it could be either. And so here, he raised up Pharaoh. He raised him up in the sense that God chooses everybody who's in charge. And so he raised up Pharaoh, but then he says, but you in particular, you were raised up for this purpose. You were raised up so that I might show my power in you and that my name would be declared throughout all the earth. And so Pharaoh was exactly where God wanted him to be. And again, in this case, to become a means of showcasing God's power to the world. And that's exactly what ended up happening. We know that God used the refusal of Pharaoh to let the Israelites go and also to pour out his wrath upon Egypt and to prove that he's the true God of the universe. Now, it's been a long time since we went through the book of Exodus, but as we said way back then, the plagues, the 10 plagues that we're familiar with, these were not just kind of random things that God just thought up in the moment. No, these were individual attacks against the deities that the Egyptians worshiped. That's what it was. Each particular plague was God showing, you think this individual has power. No, I'm the true power. I'm the true God. And so every plague was him just knocking down the Egyptian gods one after another. That's what it was. And so God was using the plagues, again, to showcase his power. Now, in order to continue on the 10 plagues, what needed to happen was Pharaoh had to not let the people go. Right? And so the longer Pharaoh kept them, the more plagues God could pour out, the more God could show his power over the gods of the so-called God, again, of Egypt. And the more that people outside of the bounds of Egypt would hear about this. And we know that it worked. It worked. Not only, obviously, did the people get out. Obviously, we know that part. But the fact that God said that my power would be seen throughout the world. This happened. And we know this. Let me just give you one example of this. When they finally get to the promised land, they send over the spies into Jericho, and the spies meet this woman, Rahab. Rahab tells the spies in Joshua 2, she says this, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when he came out of Egypt, and what he did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, she said, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you." And then she ends by saying this, "For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath." What did they find out? Hold on, there's something special going on with that particular people. We all claim to have gods, but they don't do what that God does. Right? We all worship gods, but we ain't seen our gods do that. Right? And so God's name was proclaimed, and all of it was dependent upon what? Pharaoh. It was dependent upon this one man saying no over and over and over. And verse 19 shows us how God accomplished this. He says, "Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will, he hardeneth." Now when it comes to Pharaoh, again, you go back to the book of Exodus. 10 times in the book of Exodus we read that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. 10 times you see that. Now we need to understand what that means. The word that's used in the Old Testament means to be strengthened. To be strengthened. In other words, God simply made Pharaoh more entrenched within the positions that he already held. That's what he did. That's how he acted. In other words, God did not turn Pharaoh's heart from a desire to allow them to leave into a stubborn refusal not to leave. He strengthened them in his desire to not allow them to leave. Somebody can turn that off. Go get the remote. And so we have here Pharaoh, whose heart was already in a particular position. His heart was already one to say, I am not for the Jewish people. No, Pharaoh did not want to let them go. Do you think Pharaoh at any point thought, I would like to let all that free labor leave? No, he didn't want them to go. He didn't want them to leave. He wanted them to stay. He wanted the situation to remain as it was. And so Pharaoh was saying no already. And God, what did he do? He said, I'm going to make you kick in your heels where you already stubbornly want to say no. He didn't say, it wasn't as if Pharaoh thought, man, I love the Jewish people. If only they would come and ask for a leave, I would give it to them. And then God took that heart of love and turned it into a heart that said no. No, he strengthened the heart of Pharaoh from a position of no into a position of you better believe it's no. That's what he did. He took one that already didn't want to let him go, and he made him, again, dig in his heels in that particular position. And so he strengthened his heart in that way, or, again, we would say it, he hardened his heart in that way. And this point is made even more clear in verse 19. The word for harden in verse 19 means to make obstinate or to make stubborn. And so, again, God didn't make Pharaoh refuse kicking and screaming. Pharaoh just, he wanted to say yes. He wanted to say yes, and God made him say no. No, he made him, again, more entrenched. He made him more stubborn than he already was. Why? To give mercy to the Israelites. That's why. To give mercy to the Israelites. Thus he will give mercy to whoever he wants, as he told Moses, and he will harden whoever he wants, as he did to Pharaoh. Now both are within his right as God, and neither are beyond what is fair or what is righteous. No, they are all squarely within the nature of God to do with as he pleased. Now, again, this isn't just in a vacuum here. There's a context in which Paul is speaking here. And so the implication is that as God hardened the heart of Pharaoh for his glory to be seen, that's what he's doing now with Israel. That's what he says. Why do you think that all, or at least most, of the Jewish people are rejecting their Messiah? Well, God's doing something. That's what he says. God's doing something. Why do so many Jews not believe? Because God is using the hardness of their heart that his name might be declared throughout all the earth. That's what he's doing right now with Israel. You could say, in a sense, Israel has become Pharaoh. Right? And God is using the hardness of the heart of Israel to proclaim his name and to proclaim his glory throughout all the earth. Why are you and I today as Gentiles a part of this? Well, because God's hardening some hearts. Now again, what does that mean? Does that mean that the Jewish people as a whole desperately want to believe in Jesus as their Messiah? And God's, reaching into their heart and saying, no, you don't get to believe. No. It means that he's strengthening their disbelief. That's what he's doing. He's strengthening their disbelief. It's very similar in concept to what we saw earlier in Romans chapter 1. He has given them over. He has given them over to continue living the life that they were living. He has given them over to their unbelief. You've unbelieved, I'm not going to change it. You unbelieve, you reject me, you have made that abundantly clear. Well, I'm going to harden your heart in the decisions that you have already made. I'll quote Witherington here. He said, this remark must not be isolated from the rest of what Paul is saying here. If Israel is any analogy, then hardening does not mean damning. It involves a temporal action of limited duration. The point of this discussion, in any case, is to deal with the fate and condition of Israel, not Pharaoh. How does one explain the Jews' rejection of their Messiah? What hope do they still have? Israel was destined to stumble so that Gentiles might rise. But also, and then he adds this, so that all might rise up by the grace of God. And so again, to look ahead just a little bit, when we get over to Romans 11, we'll see this. But Paul says that blindness in part is happened to Israel. You could say another way, there's been a hardening in part of the people of Israel. But he says blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And then he says this, and so all Israel shall be saved. And so this isn't a condemnation of the wholesale people of Israel. This is a temporary hardening, a temporary blinding, you could say, for Gentiles and for the rest of the world to see and know who God is, and ultimately one day so that all the Jews will see and know who God is. It's a hardening of a small group so that the larger group can know the truth of God, can know the truth of Christ, can know the love and the grace and the mercy that he offers. And so Paul here is saying again, what is happening now, it's not out of left field. It's consistent with God. This is how he has always operated. You're just unhappy now that you're the ones that is happening to. That's what's going on, right? For the whole history of the people of Israel, you have been blessed beyond measure. You have been blessed beyond what you ever deserved. We've seen that as we've gone through the Old Testament in our Sunday school, right? Where they consistently reject the covenant. They consistently rebel against God. At times, whenever they do finally do right, we find out that they hadn't done it that way ever, right? When you get Josiah who proclaimed the Passover, what do we read? That they hadn't held the Passover so faithful since the time of the judges. We're talking about hundreds of years of history where they were just completely failing in this particular aspect of the covenant. And yet what? God blessed them. Year after year, generation after generation, king after king, God gave them mercy that they most certainly did not deserve. Well, that's not the case right now. Is that inconsistent with God? No, it's absolutely consistent with the way that he has always operated. And so the conclusion that Paul comes to in the question of, is God unfair? Obviously so, but it is an unequivocal no. No, because God gives mercy to who he wills, even though they deserve judgment. No, because God hardens who he wills in order to show his power, in order to show his glory, or in our case, in order to bring other people in. We'll see that again as we move forward. One of these is the lack of deserved judgment. The other is the deserved treatment of unjust sinners. Neither of which is unfair. Neither of which is unfair. The fact of the matter is, and I'll close with this. The fact of the matter is, people don't actually want God to be fair. They say that. People decry God for being unfair. You don't want God to be fair. That's not what you want. You don't want a fair God. That's not what you really want. They want him to be merciful. They want him to pour out his grace, but they cry foul when he actually is fair. You don't want a fair God. You want an unfair God in your favor. That's what you want. No, people cry that God's not fair. You're not asking for a fair God. People want God's grace, people want God's mercy, but they want him to do it at the expense of his holiness. It's a line he will not take. And so to this, I think we can all comfortably say along with Abraham. When Abraham was meeting with God before he sends his angels to Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham says this to God, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And we know that he will. Let's pray. Lord, again, we make our way through a difficult passage of Scripture.